Welcome back to 10 and 20, the official podcast of the Battle of Franklin Trust, where we talk about interesting aspects of Tennessee history in roughly 20 minutes. My name's Sarah.
And my name's Brad. The story this week is set in the Jim Crow era of American history, a time of segregation and legal disenfranchisement of African Americans. And we'll be talking about Josie Wells, an African American woman who became a successful and influential doctor here in Tennessee during that time period. And we have a special guest this week.
Yes, it's our coworker, Kristi, who's also our staff genealogist. She's going to share with us the research that she's done on Josie.
So we're going to begin our interview with Kristi right now and tune in 2 weeks for part 2 of this series. Thank you so much for listening. Were you expecting our recording studio to be as high-tech as it is?
No. I thought it was just going to be a little, microphone set up in the attic. But
that is
nice.
Literally exactly what it is.
Yeah, for those of you guys who don't listen to us all the time, all of our recent episodes have been recorded in the attic of Carnton.
I thought you were recording in the cellar.
We did
the cellar of you in the cellar.
We did the cellar of Carter House once when we did the episode on Todd. But we've realized there's more consistent sound up here.
And people go into the basement all the time.
So you are our staff genealogist. You're also a tour guide like Sarah and I, but you are a genealogist. Why don't you tell us, what is genealogy?
Genealogy is the study of families, and I'm particularly interested in the human perspective of history, which is why I'm interested in families. I love to see how events like the Civil War and women's suffrage and even things as, that you hear about, just like going west to strike gold. I like to see how those events affected families and how families reacted to those.
When you do that research, does it make those, how does it change your perspective on people in the past? Does it humanize them more?
Yeah, and it makes you understand history more. One of my grandfathers, for instance, he was a Confederate soldier, 32nd Georgia Infantry, and I didn't know. I really literally knew next to nothing about him. And I found his pension records. And his pension records, he had been given furlough in September of 1964. And they said, were you with your men or your regiment when they mustered out? And he said no. He said he was home on furlough, sick. And they said, why didn't you return to your men? He said, Sherman and the entire U.S. or federal army, he said, were between me and my men. There was no way to get back. And for me, you take that moment and you take Sherman marching towards the sea, and you have this family member that you can put in that moment in history. It makes history come alive.
Did you start this with your own family? Did you start this doing genealogy work for other people?
I started it with my own family when my grandfather died. Now, I was a nerdy 8-year-old girl writing family trees for the Kennedy family and the royal family because I didn't really know my own family tree. So I would sit on the ground and make all these family trees of the Kennedys and the royal family, basically. But when my grandfather died, I was 27, and I had always been interested. And I worked at the library. I helped other people do research and find things when they needed it, but I hadn't really done my own. And when my grandfather died, it was a way to grieve. And he didn't know anything about his family. So that's when I started looking into it. And I started traveling south to interview his cousins. I know more of his cousins than he ever knew. And for me, it was a way to heal, to find those pieces of him that none of us knew. And so, that's
so you were able to kind of reconstruct who he was in a way that you may never have known because of that research.
Yeah, and he was only in his early 60s when he died, so he was young, and he didn't know much about his own family because his mother had died when he was 4 years old. So he knew nothing about her side of the family, and then my family moved from Georgia. It was in the Great Migration in the late 40s, early 50s. They moved north for work because there was no work where he was down in Georgia. My great-grandfather, that is. And so when you move like that and you're impoverished, this family was impoverished. They were sharecroppers. So they moved north and they lost contact. They didn't really, maybe went south only a couple more times his entire life. And when he was 16 years old and he moved north was the only time my grandfather ever saw his cousins. And they passed through the town they were in, so they stopped. And those were the cousins that I've actually interviewed and met. And for me, I was able to rebuild my grandfather in a different light than just knowing him as a little girl, So.
Yeah. that's really cool.
And at what point would you say that you became a professional genealogist?
Last year when I got my certification. However, I've been doing it since I was 27, so almost 20 years. After I started on my own family tree, what I did was every single one of my friends, I started working on their genealogies, every branch of my family tree, and not just mine. I worked on my aunt's, who is not blood related, my uncle's. I worked on every branch because the more variety you have in research, the more experience that you're able to gain. It's not just, people coming from England and Ireland, which is basically what's in. I have so much Scots, Irish, and German. I don't have a lot of anything else. So mine was very, very boring in that aspect. It's very pre-revolutionary American is where my family fit into it. So I started going to the people I worked with at the library, and I was like, let me do your family tree. And I tried to get African Americans and new immigrants, and I completely did it on my own, that learning process. And I didn't learn how to do it the right way. So I never learned all of the proper way for citations and writing reports. So I didn't do that till last year, but there was never a need for it. I was able to interview, I taught genealogy classes at the local community center where I lived in Ohio. And I volunteered with the Library of Congress, and I was able to interview World War II soldiers, which all of those they go into that same concept of genealogy. It's the human experience, because I wasn't asking about battles. I was asking about their mother, and I was asking, how they felt as these things are going on around them. So I probably couldn't tell you a single battle any of those soldiers were in, but I can tell you how they felt and how they reacted to everything that was the chaos that was erupting around them during World War II. Those are the things that I remember. So when I research, those are the things I look for. And even when I'm studying the Battle of Franklin, when Eric told me you have to go and you have to do battlefield tours, and I'm like, oh my gosh.
Oh, you were not excited about that.
I was not excited at all, because there's regiments and ranks. I still don't know their regiments and ranks, all of them. I mean, I'm getting better, but I remember human stories. So I went out into every regiment that I knew I had to remember, and I plucked out soldiers. And so I can tell you Valentine Clump. Valentine Clump was in the 50th Ohio.
I picked his name out randomly and told you to, or you were asking me to pick a name out randomly, and I picked out Valentine Clump because his name was hilarious.
Yeah, and it wasn't an easy name to research, Brad. Thanks about that. There were like 3 or 4 Valentine Clumps from the same area.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I know the personal stories. I know the human perspective. I know what they did when they got home. And I know how many kids they had and what they experienced, where they were on the battlefield and how that experience must have affected them. I don't remember how much artillery was fired.
Well, and that's important because I think a lot of people are turned off by history because it can be all about memorizing facts and figures and statistics. But having your perspective come in and talk about, well, who was this person? What made them tick? Like making people that lived 150 years ago into real human beings who made real decisions makes it so much more relatable for a lot of people. So I think that's really important.
Our next thing is you're going to talk about, why don't you tell us who you're going to talk about?
Josie Wells. And Josie Wells stumbled into my life about March or April of this year. And I saw her from across the room. And I was at Macklemore House.
You saw her from across the room?
It really is. It sounds like such a silly thing. But I saw her from across the room. And my friend Billy and I were sitting there at Macklemore House.
Which is another
historic site, which is that Macklemore House tells the story from slavery to freedom. So it's a different story than we tell here at the Battle of Franklin Trust. So it's a great place to be able to share different stories. Anyway, Billy and I were sitting there, and we weren't getting a lot of traffic. It's cold. It's still early in the season. So we were sitting there, and they have newspapers hanging up on the wall, and they are letters from Santa Claus. It's a black newspaper, the Nashville Globe from 1918, so World War I. But it's Christmas time, and they have all these wonderful letters that children have written into Santa Claus asking for nuts and, shoes and all of the, like a bear or a doll. It's very, very basic things, especially when you look at kids' lists today.
Right.
But I was looking over, and they also have, which doesn't make sense, but they have it. They have all of these prominent women, African-American women that are on the pages as well. And Billy and I were sitting across the room, and I looked over, and I'm like, why is there one man on that paper? And, Billy just said, oh. And I got up and I went over and I looked, I'm like, Billy, this isn't a man. This is a woman. Her name's Josie Wells. And I looked right below her, and it was her eyes that pulled me in, because she has the most confident stare. She pulls you in with these eyes because she's this African-American woman. In 1918, she's wearing a suit and she's a doctor. And you can see the confidence and the absolute self-worth she must have felt to even get to the level that she was at to be a doctor, right? And so it said right below her name, Dr. Josie Wells. And right below that, it said Superintendent of Hubbard Hospital. And I looked, I'm like, oh my gosh, Billy, I think she was the head of the hospital. So really at that point, her eyes drew me in, and I thought, I want to know more about this woman. So I went home and I started researching. Actually, I didn't go home. I pulled out my computer right there at Macklemore House. And Billy and I, he sat beside me as I started researching. And Josie just started to develop. She started to come into this frame. And she really, at first it was just basic. A couple articles popped up. Josie Wells, superintendent of Hubbard Hospital, raising money for the hospital, little things like that. But the thing that struck me the most is when I looked at her age. She was my age, 44 years old. In 1921, when she died, she was almost exactly my age at the point when I located her, or when I came across her, I should say. And I don't know, for some reason that was important.
Was some of the newspapers that talked about her reference her as the first female doctor in Tennessee, or was that...
Well, they'll say first female doctor, first graduate of Meharry Medical, and that was one of the things that when I first started researching her, I'm like, oh my God, she's the first doctor. And it was one of the things that really made me excited. But then you start researching more and you start realizing that people will just, they'll exaggerate, which I'm fond of. However, you can't do that when you're researching someone and you're creating this story or finding their story, not creating a story. You're finding their story. So Josie was one of the first female graduates of Meharry Medical. And she was, at the time when she graduated, between 1904 and 1910, she was the only female practicing doctor in Nashville. So she was running her own clinic at that point, and she ran a clinic for only women and children. If you were a man, you weren't even allowed to come to her clinic. She did treat also students at Fisk University, at Meharry. She was the doctor on staff at Walden University. She worked at Hubbard Hospital as well. She was the superintendent, so she obviously worked there as well. And I'm sure she treated many men. But in her clinic that she ran 2 days a week from Napier Court in Nashville, she only treated women and children, and she gave medical care for free. And she didn't discriminate by race, but she wouldn't treat men.
Why don't we, before we get into too many of Josie's accomplishments, why don't we start at her beginning, where her story starts?
Her story starts, in my opinion, she was born in 1876. There are conflicting dates for her birth, depending on when you look, the 1900 census, all of these places. But she was born in 1876 on November 28th. In Holly Springs, Mississippi. She was the daughter of slaves, and she was one of their youngest children. And her father actually was, he was a man by the name of Barry English, and he was born in Kentucky, ended up in Mississippi as a slave at some point. And then after freedom, he ended up back in Sumner County, Tennessee, which is right here above Nashville. So he was in Gallatin. He had a wife and a whole slew of children. And then after his first wife died, he ended up going back to Holly Springs, Mississippi. He married Josie's mother, who already had children as well. And then they had at least 3 children of their own. So this is right before the overwhelming yellow fever epidemic that wiped out a portion of the population in Holly Springs. You would see articles in Minnesota newspapers talking about the deaths in Holly Springs, Mississippi, because it was so overwhelming what was going on in Memphis and Holly Springs. So at first they blocked out, they said nobody can come into Holly Springs, but then they opened up the border so people came in. It's actually the epidemic where Ida B. Wells' parents died. She was 16 years old. She was actually not home when her parents died, but both of her parents and her youngest sibling, Ida B. Wells, died from this yellow fever epidemic. And it's Holly Springs was not a huge town. I'm sure Josie and her parents knew Ida B. Wells. And it's interesting because Josie ends up marrying a George Wells. And Ida B had a brother named George Wells, and they all would have been about the same age. But I absolutely cannot prove that they have any relationship whatsoever.
For our listeners' sake, can you just describe who Ida B. Wells is?
Ida B. Wells is most famous because she was a suffragist. She traveled the country speaking for women's rights, but she was also speaking for Black rights, African American rights. She was protesting against the lynchings in the South, and she was writing about it because a lot of white newspapers were not talking about the lynchings that were going on. They were only talking about things that Black people did wrong. They're not talking about the things that were happening to that population of individuals. So Ida B. Wells has this newspaper, and what she puts in the newspaper are the things that, she wants to stop, like lynchings.
So Josie's story kind of mirrors and it seems to be connected in multiple ways to Ida B. Wells' story.
There are so many ways that I think that their stories, just these two African American women born in the same city, educated, growing up, strong, powerful, determined, and they have that same look in their eyes, that I'm going to take on the world, determination look. So they have so many similarities, and I would love to find a connection other than they were, they're strong, they were born in the same city, and they have the same last name.
Right. It seems like they must have known each other.
They must have, and I can find nothing to prove that, though. But hopefully eventually, because genealogy isn't something that stops. I mean, what I have today, I might find something amazing tomorrow. We could have a story here at the Battle of Franklin Trust that we think is over and we know everything, and then all of a sudden something pops up and we know a ton more.
So she grows up. What happens next? So she's born to parents who were former slaves.
She went to college in Holly Springs. Actually, Ida B. Wells' dad was on the original board for Rust University, which is down in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Josie went to a nurses' technical institute down there, which I'm fairly certain was connected to this Black college, Rust College down there. But she graduated from there. She got married to a professor named George Wells. The only thing that calls him a professor is Josie's obituary. So we're going to go with that. We're going to say he's a professor. And he ended up dying soon after. But she'd already had a baby by this point. She actually had a baby on her 20th birthday.
Wow.
So she gave birth to her daughter, Alma, on November 28th, 1896. And what happens is she's a nurse. So she moves out to Texas. She works in Dr. Greenstar's.
Josie does.
Yes. Josie and Alma move out to Texas, and they live out there for a few years. And
so she's 20 years old. She's a widow, single mother.
Yeah.
At this point.
And a nurse.
And she's going to Texas on her own. I mean, can you imagine the bravery that would have taken? I mean, I moved to Nashville when I was 39 by myself with my child, and I thought I was the bravest person in the world. And she's, a Black woman in the South, moving throughout the South, which isn't an easy thing.
No.
And, when you have it's a different world, right? So such separation for them. So she goes out to Texas and she works at this hospital, and she is the head of nurses there. She is helping to teach out there. So
did she know of a job there, or was she just striking it out?
I do not know. I have contacted San Antonio. They don't have a lot about even Dr. Starnes there. I probably know more about Dr. Starnes now than the librarian that I called, just because I want to know about all the people that surrounded Josie. Because most people, when they study family history, you have a lot of people, they want to know how far back they can get, right? But what you need to do is you need to study one generation or study one person and study everybody around them. Because you learn who that person is by the people, the individuals that were a part of their lives. So I started researching Dr. Starnes and her friend Nettie Napier, and just these individuals that I found in the newspaper with her, because you do learn about those people. So Dr. Starnes was prominent. He was studying tuberculosis, which was rampant within African American communities, and they didn't have the money and the resources, the medications to take care of it. And African Americans were living in squalor a lot of times. So he shows pictures of that and just how entire families would be debilitated by this disease. So that's what he's prominently known for, Dr. Starnes. But he had a hospital, just pretty much probably like the same thing Josie opened here in Nashville, right? You have a hospital where you're trying to give care to African Americans that's equal to what the whites are getting in the other hospitals, because Blacks weren't getting equal care in the white hospitals. So you want to provide care, and you want to provide a chance for sick African-American individuals.
So she's almost like tutoring with him in Texas, like learning those same skills.
I would say it's almost like an internship.
Okay.
And that's what she's doing. She's out there. But then in 1900, she very briefly moves back to Holly Springs, Mississippi.
And she's how old at that point?
She is
23.
Yeah, 23, 20. Yeah, about 23 years old. She's almost 24. And she's living right next door to her mother. And then by October of that year, she is here in Nashville. And she is attending Meharry Medical School. So she graduated in 1904, one of the first female graduates. And she was popular and well-liked. Everybody said she had an easy manner, a determined voice, and she made people comfortable with her medical knowledge. And just think about how incredible this is. And I cannot repeat enough. She was a Black woman in the South in the turn of the century.
Single mother.
Single mother.
Widow.
Right? And she went to, she put herself through medical school as a single Black mother in the South in the turn of the century, 1900 and 1904. That alone, I mean, look at what we've done in our lives. And you think that alone, I can't even imagine what that took.
It's a lot of courage, but it's also a lot of recognizing that you're worth it. Like you are able like to demand like I deserve this. I deserve this recognition. I'm going to earn it. I'm going to work hard for it.
Exactly. And she was the child of slaves. And for me, when I think about the opportunities that she got, they couldn't even have anticipated something like that for themselves or their children. Think about being a slave, and you've been a slave, and your parents and your grandparents, and all of a sudden you're free. And thank goodness her father was a skilled laborer, right? So he met freedom with a skill, which a lot of slaves didn't. They were laborers, so they were agriculture knowledge based. So he was a carpenter, and he was obviously a good carpenter because he had enough money to send his daughter to college. And so even being skilled, he must have had drive as well. I think both her parents must have. But they couldn't have imagined this life for their daughter. I mean, there's no way. And Josie's mother lived with her here in Nashville at the end of her life. She moved
her
here.
parents were alive through some of
Well, her
this.
father wasn't, but her mother was.
Oh.
Her mother didn't die until 1915. To have been a slave, old enough to have children during slavery, and you come out of this and you're able to send your children to college and have a daughter that's a doctor. I just think that's incredible.
Well, yeah, and imagine just the things in American history that she would have witnessed throughout her life. Talking about her mom now, like the war, Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. So I couldn't imagine seeing your child flourish like that. That would be, I'm sure that was an incredible feeling.
Move to new states, new cities.
Here's the deal. Imagine this woman, Elizabeth, who lives through all of that you just said, right? She almost makes it to the right to vote, almost makes it to that time period where she would have been able to go from being a slave to being able to vote.
Because her mom dies in 1915.
1915.
So 4 years.
Barely missed it, right? And Josie barely sees it.
And that is where we're going to pause Josie's story with Kristi. Tune in 2 weeks to part 2, where we continue on with Josie's story and talk about her impact on the Nashville community.
If you want to stay up to date about what we're doing as 10 and 20, please follow us on Instagram. It's just 10 and 20 podcast, TENNIN20 podcast on Instagram. We're going to post some pictures of Josie there. If you want to let us know a topic that you think that Sarah and I should cover, please send us an email at podcast@boft.org. That's podcast, all one word, at BOFT.org. If you want to support us financially and buy something for yourself that is pretty neat, if you go to our online store, which is store.boft.org, you can purchase one of our 10 and 20 t-shirts. And finally, if you enjoy this content, the best way to get it regularly downloaded to your phone is to subscribe via whatever podcast app is easiest. Most people do the Apple Podcast app. If that's what you do, we'd love it if you subscribe, and if you could leave us a review on iTunes. That helps us in the rankings and just to get feedback from our listeners. So thank you so much for listening.